morning, and thank you for having me here, Pa and Governor Sethaput. It's been a challenging environment for policymakers. Elevated as well as sticky inflation has prompted the most aggressive tightening in about 40 years. And on the back of that, we've seen volatility in financial markets, massive capital flows, gyrations in currencies. And we know that emerging markets in particular have been hit, especially those with high debt levels. But having said that, they have survived the tightening. Increasingly though, it's not just about monetary policy. That alone can't cut it. Other policy tools will have to be tapped into what's seen as an integrated framework. The question is, what is the right policy mix? Where are the gaps? And what is the path forward? Let's get insights from our speakers this morning. Please welcome on stage Governor Warjiyo, Governor Sethaput Suthiwartnarueput, and Deputy Governor Francis Dakila. Just to set the report straight when it comes to the fight against inflation, we know that Indonesia has stabilized. It stood pat for 7 straight meetings. We have Bangko, Thailand. It's raised for 7 straight meetings. And we have the Philippine Central Bank pausing, but suggesting that a hike may be taken when needed. But Warjiyo, give us a sense of where this fight is and how your policy mix has helped you be where you are today.
Thank you, Haslinda, and very good morning, Governor Sethaput and Dakila and everybody of you. Let me just start to be proud to be this joint conference Bank Indonesia and Bank of Thailand. Let me just, if I can be allowed to just shed some light, because this is the framework that we have to understand clearly. Before reviewing what the can I do that? No more than 10 minutes, please. Can I have my slide, please? How the Bank Indonesia policy makes the framework and the experience is all about. 3 key messages. Next slide, please. 3 key messages. 1, Indonesia is one of the best economic performers, despite the global turbulences. Why? Number 2, we are very innovative. We have the basic framework of inflation targeting framework, but we are also addressing the recent issue of capital flows, exchange rate, as well as financial system stability. I will tell you about it. Number 3, because we have very close coordination of fiscal and monetary policy. Let me start there. Next slide, please. The best performer this year, 4.5 to 5.3, so about 5.1% economic growth. Domestic consumption, investment, inflation coming down quickly, one of the fastest in the world. Last year, close to 7%. Now, last month is only 3% and will be coming down. Third, current account deficit very low. Exchange rate, year to date is appreciation, even though recently depreciation. And last but not least, lending growing 9 to 11% this year, 10 to 11%. Next slide. So, what is the lesson? Everybody in the emerging market face the policy trilemma. Well, of course, US struggling only using one interest rate for fighting inflation. Take a very long time. And now, recession. Europe, high inflation is very high. Fed fund rate, we thought that we will be completed, but will be 1 time or 2 more time. Why? Only using one interest rate for fighting everybody. Cannot. We are seeing it making possible the impossible trinity, the policy trilemma in emerging. And we have to, of course, global spillover. We have to price stability and financial stability, but we also have to support economic growth. We have to be able to withstand the global spillover. Why? Just open monetary policy. Not only using interest rate, but also exchange rate policy, capital placement. We don't care about what the IMF says. To be angry you. What we do is, you know, smarter, but we are more experienced. I will tell you. You may be thought smarter, but we are more experienced. But we also using monetary macro-prudential fiscal policy. I will tell you about Indonesia experience. Next. So this is what in my book, in Solikin. We have monetary policy, impossible trinity, price stability and growth, Philip curve. Using interest rate, Taylor rule, whatever rule we use, we are the best inflation targeting framework in the past. But we complement with exchange rate stability. We not deviate from inflation targeting framework. We continue inflation targeting framework, but complement with exchange rate stability. This is what we do. In some aspect, we need to capital flows management. But Indonesia refraining of using capital flows management. This what monetary policy and open economy of the ASEAN. Governor Sethaput can explain later on. But most of the ASEAN using also the exchange rate stability to complement inflation targeting frame. But we combine with macro-prudential policy. Macro-prudential, how to counter cyclical or pro-cyclicality of the financial. When lending is low, then relax. Macro-prudential. When lending is too high, we tighten. Counter cyclical, but also financial system stability and inclusion. This is what we do in Indonesia. That's why for this year and next year, our policy makes monetary pro-stability, addressing inflation, exchange rate stability, pro-stability, using interest rate complement with exchange rate policy. Macro-prudential, because we are cycling just up, lending is too low. That's why macro-prudential is loose, accommodative. This is what we write in our book, Central Bank Policy. That's why in Indonesia, monetary policy, pro-stability, macro-prudential, pro-growth, complement by financial market deepening, financial inclusion, digitalization, and so on. Next, to be complete, this is the list. Monetary policy, that's why since last year, we increased our inflation interest rate 2.75 without being asked, because we are very prudent, disciplined, inflation targeting framework. We are among the first that raise interest rate 2.75, but now inflation is 3%. Within our target, faster and quicker than we do, because we complement exchange rate not only to stabilize exchange rate, but to address imported inflation. So being also helped by imported inflation. That's why we work through and how to withstand the Fed fund rate. We're not increasing our policy rate, but also managing government bond yield. What matter is not policy rate, government bond yield influence responding to government bond. That's why we do twist operation. We sell our government bond short term, our yield government bond increase, and then inflow. For the longer term, because my sister, Minister of Finance, we are close, we do not intervene in that. We do not want to crowding out on the 10 years and longer. So when you ask if the Fed fund rate increase, let the Fed fund rate increase. But we increase our government bond yield in the short term. You do the twist over sell our government bond in the short term. Yield government bond short term increase, inflow in. This is the macro-prudential for pro-growth. We are accommodative. All of our macro-prudential instrument is for increasing lending. Loan to value ratio 100%. Even we are giving incentive liquidity to the bank up to 4% of third party for those banks that lending to priority sector, like downstreaming of mineral, downstreaming of agriculture, downstreaming of crop, downstreaming of maritime, tourism, SME, green. We are giving macro liquidity incentive up to 4% of third party. There is nowhere in the world, the textbook, this is innovation that we address all of the macro. Digitalization, you see the digitalization very fast growing. Thank Governor Sethaput and other. We are regional payment connectivity, one of the fastest in the world, where our cross-border retail is connected. And last but not least, we are, next slide, close coordination with the government. Fiscal and monetary. Minister of Finance, myself, always contacting every day, every week. We are very close, not only in our position, but as brother and sister. Fiscal morality, but also with my president, structural reform. We continue discussing what structural reform need to be done, not only infrastructure, downstreaming, digitalization, SME, and green. This is the story of framework experience of Indonesia. Thank you.
Governor Sethaput, when it comes to the framework you're adopting, it's pretty complicated as well. It's been challenging because you have debt amounting to 90% of GDP, and you have a currency that's been volatile and in flux. I mean, how do you take all of that into consideration when thinking about your policy mix?
Very carefully. And I think the reason, Governor Perry laid it out well, that we are at the Bank of Thailand strong proponents of the integrated policy framework is because we feel that it's important to have a varied enough toolkit to handle the multiple objectives that we have. I mean, if we have a limited toolkit and very few instruments, it just puts too much burden on the one instrument to handle multiple objectives. And so it allows us to handle the trade-offs better. It gives us more degrees of freedom in how to achieve our overall objectives. And if I may just add to what Governor Perry has said, I think the need for this kind of framework is particularly pronounced for emerging market economies, and especially emerging market economies in Asia. Why? Because we're very vulnerable to capital flows, very destabilizing capital flows that happen. I mean, the whole COVID experience with this very high, rapid increase in interest rates in the advanced economies, having nothing to do with us, has led to these very, very volatile exchange rates and very large movements in capital flows, which would be very hard for us to handle if we were to rely only on one instrument like the interest rate. And so the need to complement that with other kind of measures like foreign exchange intervention is all the more marked. In Thailand last year, we had, I think, gross capital flows in the order of about 500+ billion. That's well over 100% of our GDP. So, and a lot of that was driven again by what was happening with the Fed and global factors. So the fact that Asia, I think, as a region is very vulnerable to these capital flows, the fact that FX markets in Asia, in Thailand, I should say in particular, quite thin. So when you get these movements in capital flows, they result in very large movements in the exchange rates, and the exchange rate volatility as a result is very, very high. Our markets in general, in emerging markets, are not as liquid or as deep as the advanced economy, so we're very susceptible to that. And as we all know, the exchange rate is something that matters hugely for so many of our economies because we're very small and we're very open economies. I'm struck every time when I go to these meetings with central bank governors that depending upon where we sit, the conversation can be very, very different. I mean, if you sit and have lunch with the advanced economies, central bank governors, right, the conversation invariably drifts to like inflation, labor markets, right, things like that. Yes. But you sit with the Asian central bank governors, exchange rate. And I think again that shows you again that the need to have this a toolkit that is able to handle these.
We talk about managing fluctuations in currencies. For instance, I know for Bank Indonesia, intervention in the FX space comes to mind. But when it comes to BOT, there's less intervention, so to speak. I mean, why adopt a different approach from what Bank Indonesia is adopting?
No, intervention is part of our toolkit, along with this integrated policy framework. But just the way we've communicated our approach towards FX intervention is that we allow the exchange rate to move in line with market conditions, because we know that it's, you can't really resist the market as I think many Asian countries learned after the 1997 Asian crisis. So we allow the exchange rate to move in line with market forces. But when the movements are too rapid and they're not underpinned by fundamentals in some cases, then we would step in to intervene to try to limit some of the volatility. And the reason is again because that if the impact on the economy can be quite large because again it's a very open economy. We have a lot of SMEs. A lot of the smaller firms tend not to hedge, so they get hit very hard when the exchange rate becomes too volatile. And the markets, as I mentioned, are thin. So when you see these flows, which might not be that large, and you see these large movements in exchange rates, and you know that there's a need to try to smooth out some of that volatility. But in terms of the direction of the movements, no, that we feel is too difficult to handle, yeah, and we would not want to go there.
Deputy Governor Dakila, in terms of the policy mix in the Philippines?
Oh, yes. We've always said that we remain committed to market determination for the exchange rate, and that is the best means of making sure that we have an independent policy rate that can address inflation concerns. But having said that, there can be situations like in the second half of 2022 when after the Fed began its aggressive round of adjustments, there was pressure on the currency, and it was threatening to get to a point when inflation expectations can become unhinged. And so at that point, the governor thought that it is best that we intervene in the market. So the general framework is one of letting the market determine the path where there is a balance between supply and demand in the foreign exchange market, but for the central bank to reserve the right to enter into the market in order to make sure that there are no disorderly developments in the foreign exchange market that can dislodge inflation expectations and disanchor them from the target.
Can I just come back on the exchange rate? Well, we used to think the word of emerging economy like pharma market efficient. Remember? We used to think everything is beautiful. Information flowy, market behavior flowy, and then we just let exchange rate to be determined by market. This is in the theory. Practically, in most emerging country, pharma market efficient hypothesis may not be whole. One, we are small country, being subjective to global spillover, unprecedented and very frequent. Then, we cannot rely on the stick of 278 million people of Indonesian by assuming the word is like market efficient hypothesis. We cannot. Okay. We may also think, okay, some of them like don't boost overshooting hypothesis because price sticky or whatever rigidity in domestic market. Maybe Sebastian and what portfolio balance theory, which is actually the need of attractive portfolio inflows. So this is the experience of the theory, research, and the experience of emerging country. Okay, in most cases, if the shock is NIID, normal distribution, market mechanism work, we just let market to be determined, like pharma efficient hypothesis. But when too much, dollar is very strong. We cannot let exchange rate to be determined by market. We have to intervene using our foreign exchange reserve. Why? Otherwise, our inflation will be at risk. Otherwise, we will also need to increase interest rate later on, back to square one. So we need to intervene not only to stabilize volatility, but also to ensure the imported inflation do not impact our goal domestic autonomy objective of price stability and growth. So what we do in exchange rate just to protect ourselves, the small countries, to the big brothers in the world, which is like Dr. Sethaput, inflation, labor supply, increasing interest rate. We have to protect ourselves to again global base, the basic principle of inflation targeting framework as the basic framework.
Is there a risk of an over-reliance on FX intervention? Governor Sethaput.
Yes, obviously. I think we learned that from the Asian crisis, if nothing else, and the importance of having a policy framework that's coherent, the impossible trinity that was mentioned, right? I mean, that's one of the things that I think we learned from the Asian crisis. It's not something that just pops up in a textbook. No, it really matters. So having the right kind of policy framework that's internally consistent, that's coherent, consistent with long-term equilibrium, that's very important. And that to try to rely on just any one single instrument, obviously is, risky.
Deputy Governor Dakila, your thoughts? I mean, given that the Philippine peso has gone from one of the best performing currencies in Asia to one of the worst.
Yeah. It's the main consideration is the inflation outlook and how that relates to the target band. And so in our most recent episode, what we see is that by the fourth quarter of this year, inflation should be back to within the band, and that should continue for the policy horizon, which is 2024 and 2025. And so given that, the Monetary Board has thought that there is a space to keep the policy stance unchanged now for 2 successive meetings. But the messaging has been quite hawkish, being ready to act whenever there are developments that can threaten the achievement of the inflation target. And of course, one of those factors that will need to be considered would be what the Fed would be doing and the spillovers, and what that means for the foreign exchange market. And we've also been consistent with our messaging that, again, should repeat of the situation that took place in the second half of last year happen again, then there is room again to have intervention in the foreign exchange market. But having said that, because as of now, the intervention comes in, and what would be good is if you have an explicit framework. Although in our case, there is no commitment to go into an integrated policy framework, but that's something that we would be studying. The thing is, when the questions are, when do you intervene and to how much do you intervene? And it's good if those questions can be asked within a framework that takes a look at all the policy instruments that are available to the central bank.
Well, Perry, I just want to pick up on your point on how there should be coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. How has that played out for Indonesia? And of course, linked to that, Governor Sethaput, you also talked about how fiscal needs to be restrained. We'll get your thoughts right after.
The good thing in Indonesia, we have a fiscal discipline. By law, fiscal deficit cannot exceed 3% of GDP, except under special circumstances, which is needed emergency law, like over the past 3 years. That's exception rather than the rule. The rule, fiscal rule of Indonesia, fiscal deficit cannot exceed 3% of GDP. That's one. That's actually where the basic principle of fiscal prudence there. Bank Indonesia, basic principle of inflation targeting framework is there. So theoretically, becoming easier to have fiscal and monetary policy coordination. That's one. Number two, every year when government presenting the budget to the parliament, we are invited. Not only the preparation, but during the discussion with the parliament, ensuring the basic assumption of macro growth, inflation, exchange rate, yield, whatever monetary factor, listening to central bank. So budget formulation, also we have fiscal and monetary coordination. Third, we have regular meeting, yearly meeting between Minister of Finance and myself and all, which is the plan of financing of the budget. How much issuing government bond domestically, overseas? What is the impact? This yearly. Quarterly, we have discussion not only between Minister of Finance and myself, but on under financial system stability. We discuss macroeconomic aspect as well as financial stability aspect. Every month, every week, I have chatting with Minister of Finance. So how close we, both Minister of Finance and myself, not only by law, by process, decision maker, but also personal coordination of fiscal monetary, where we are two of us guiding this country for stability and supporting economic growth.
And that coordination is almost impossible when you don't have a government yet. And also, during the campaign period, all political parties promised excessive spending, and that's a huge concern for Thailand.
Yeah, I mean, if, on the issue of fiscal monetary policy coordination, I think the objective now, I think, is one where we need to normalize policy both on the monetary side and on the fiscal side. So yeah, ideally we would like to see greater steps towards fiscal consolidation, because we had run very large deficits during COVID like every other country. So we'd like to see normalization of the fiscal policy front. But if I may, if we go on the fiscal and monetary policy issues, that's a huge area. We're going to go off quite a bit. If I could come back a bit, just offer a few more thoughts on the integrated policy framework, which has to do again with what we're doing on the interest rate front, on FX intervention, and on macroprudential measures. I think from the comments that have been made, I think it's quite clear that the motivation, the logic for it is fairly sound, right? You have, instead of relying just on one tool, you use multiple instruments to achieve multiple objectives. So you don't rely too much excessively on any one tool, which could be risky. And if you call it integrated policy framework, right? Who could argue against that? An integrated policy sounds much better than a disintegrated policy. So it sounds almost like a truism, and that this kind of makes sense. I think the logic of it is fairly sound. The issue, the difficulty, is in the implementation, on the execution of it, and I think that the second panel will probably touch upon this, but if I may offer a few thoughts on this. It's short answer would be it's not easy to do, and we're a big fan of it, like I said, but it's not easy to achieve in practice, and there are a bunch of reasons for that. There are a lot of analytical challenges that make it difficult to achieve. I mean, if we think, for example, in terms of interest rate policies, we have fairly good tools that we can use, right? Taylor rules, right? Natural rate of interest, R-star, we have this kind of toolkit that we use as a guide. But for FX intervention, trickier. Yeah, it's, so being able to develop more analytical tools to help guide us in making those kinds of decisions, I think is an important challenge. And again, I hope the second panel will touch upon this. The other challenge is aside from the analytical issue is in terms of implementation and execution. If we think about these different instruments that we're talking about here, the implementation lags are very, very different. They operate across hugely different time horizons, right? Macroprudential measures take a very long time to design and put in place. Like, so for example, when we did our LTV measures and trying to tighten them, it took us about 6 months because you have to consult a lot of people, and obviously there's a lot of resistance to it. But you think about monetary policy, right? Our monetary policy committee meetings, they meet every two months. It's a shorter time horizon. And you think about FXI, foreign exchange intervention, that's a daily, right? Almost an hourly thing that you're looking at. So the implementation of these things occurs over a very different time horizon. So trying to properly integrate it and properly coordinate it is very tough. And that's on the implementation side. There's also a tricky issue in terms of the impact and the effects that it has, because they occur with very different lags. Macroprudential, you typically think about trying to address financial cycle issues. The financial cycle, very long, right? 10 plus years or whatever. Interest rates, the effect of the business cycle, shorter, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, say, horizon. And foreign exchange intervention, right, is like immediate, daily. So trying to properly coordinate these things is very tricky. And I hope, again, the second panel will be able to address some of these issues. But I do think it's a worthwhile thing to do because, again, given the challenges that we discussed that we face here, it's a multiple thing, challenges on many fronts, and using excessive reliance on any one kind of tool will get us in trouble.
Governor Dakila, the challenges in implementing this integrated framework, and perhaps where are the gaps?
Right now, what we are concentrated on is in strengthening the channels of impact of our main policy instrument on the financial markets. So for quite some time, the central bank has been constrained by the availability of instruments, and that was relaxed with the amendments to the charter. So now we can issue our own securities. For a long time, we were not able to do that unless there is a declaration by the Monetary Board of the existence of an economic emergency, which is almost self-defeating, because when you do that, then you spook the markets. And so that prevented the central bank from issuing its own securities. So now we have issued our securities of various tenors, and we are now looking at how to enhance the channel of impact of the main instrument, which is the reverse repurchase facility on interest rates. And again, for a long time, we were constrained by the availability of collateral. But because of the pandemic, we bought a lot of government securities, and so that relaxed our constraint. So we're now going to be shifting to market auctions for the RRP, whereas before it was at a fixed rate and a fixed volume instrument. So after that, so it's a long process. After that, we're looking at further changing the way we do our forecasts. This is in line with the IPF, because the IPF needs a suite of models to be able to support it. It's a little bit more technical, but we're shifting away from econometric models into models that would support the integrated policy framework. We're at the stage where we're incorporating macroprudential policies into that model. But before we complete the process, we would need to put in again the fiscal policy, so that we can take a look at the entire range of instruments that would be available to the government. But again, having said that, it's just a framework. And the thing is, what do you do with the framework while at the same time making sure that the communication is clear, that the main focus of the central bank would be to maintain price stability, and that the main focus of the policy instrument would be that any changes in the stance of policy would be in relation to the inflation outlook.
This is the issue where the framework is still continue dynamic developing, need practical experience as well as sharing each other. The issue where monetary policy and macro-prudential policy need to be integrated. And the three layer. One, Governor Sethaput already mentioned, what is the objective of each of the policy? Monetary policy is economic cycle. Just, counter-cyclical of the economic cycle. Raising interest rate when economic cycle forecasted to the future above the trajectory. Loosening when below, using interest rate. Then we need to comply exchange rate to protect ourselves, our domestic autonomy of managing Philip cost from Fed fund rate, from dollar, from wherever. That's the exchange rate policy, capital flows management needed. So they already settled. Inflation target complemented by exchange rate stability and capital flows when needed. That's already settled. The issue is macro-prudential. The objective is how to manage the pro-cyclicality of the economic financial cycle. My apology. Governor Sethaput right. Financial cycle is a bit longer, but we need to address with macro-prudential. When economic cycle up, financial cycle will follow. And back then the issue macro-prudential need to be accommodative. Like Indonesia now. Economic cycle is just up, not in the top. Financial cycle is just up. That's why our macro-prudential need to be accommodative. So we do that. This is macro-prudential. How about micro-prudential? This is financial service authority where actually macro financial linkage and micro individual of financial sector need to be discussed. Mostly will be the same boat, but some of the financial issues may be mismanagement. That's micro-prudential. So that the issue. So macro-prudential per se to address to manage the pro-cyclicality of the financial cycle is already settled. Even though Governor Sethaput right, we need to do more on the research, the cycle, how long, up and down, what is the matters, and so on. And also on the macro-prudential aspect, how to protect from the global. In Indonesia, we use more macro-prudential to address debt. Fiscal debt, done. Bank must go to Bank Indonesia. We cannot let bank to just freely overseas borrowing. That's a macro-prudential. Corporate, we issue macro-prudential principle that for corporate, yes, they can free borrow abroad, but hedging, liquidity, rating. So macro-prudential to address the excessive debt behavior. That's why Indonesia is under. Then we have degree of freedom between monetary policy and macro-prudential because address of the extra debt being addressed by macro. This is the settle that we also discussed with the IMF because we think IMF think this is capital flows management. We think this macro-prudential. Then this is the debate on and on. Okay, it's up to you. We do what we believe. The third aspect is when monetary and macro need to be integrated. This is where actually we need to be more discussion and more practice. For example, right now, okay, when we maintain our policy rate, exchange rate, but how to also address the domestic financial stability. This is where integrated, then we have to do more research, DSGE type, even AI, generated model that we have to do both to integrate on the implementation aspect of monetary instrument and macro. But the objective, the basic framework, what the tool, how to address the global spillover, that, or I think more and more becoming clear, but how to integrate to the policy instrument in the implementation. That's the heart rather than mind, experience rather than the theory. This is the art of the governance.
We talk a lot about macro financial policies. I mean, I think it was the BIS and IMF that said that it's more preemptive. It's better when it's preemptive as opposed to a response to shocks. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree. Yeah, no, I think on that, I'm sure all the governors would agree with that statement. But if I may just add just one thing that I think comes out from the discussion quite clearly is I think the need to be flexible in our approach, because
how have you exercised that flexibility?
By not taking a very dogmatic or too doctrinarian approach. I mean, if you look across all our economies, our situations are quite different. I mean, we share some common characteristics, but there are a lot of things that are different. So trying to have like a prescriptive kind of one-size-fits-all approach on this integrated policy framework, clearly not a good idea. So I think that's one key takeaway, that any kind of usage of the integrated policy framework, it's a framework, so it needs to take into account country-specific circumstances and adjust the tools that you use accordingly. And I think in terms of being realistic about what one can expect from the framework and the models and the tools that we developed, as Governor Perry mentioned, given the limitations of those tools, there will always be a need for judgment. It's not going to be like this kind of you see A, therefore B is the solution. That's not quite there. So I think that's important to emphasize.
I think it's time to take questions from the floor. Just raise your hand, and I think a mic will come your way.
Hello, good morning. We from Bank of Laos. Given we have faced complex and multi-dimensional challenge since 2020, such as COVID-19 pandemics and global turmoil. So, what are the role of BI's policy mix to maintain stability as the foundation to promote economic recovery?
I don't think we can get that question. I think there's been inconsistent levels. Could we just make sure that the mic is okay?
Hello.
One more time, please.
Hello,
what's
good
the
morning.
question?
Hello. Good morning.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yep, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm Pui from Bank of Laos. So I have a question. So given we have faced complex and multi-dimensional challenges since 2020, such as COVID-19 pandemics and global turmoil. So my question is, what are the role of BI's policy mix to maintain stability, such as the foundation to promote economic recovery? Thank you.
The role of policy mix to ensure financial
you want
stability.
You want to collect or can I answer direct?
First.
Okay, the framework is only happen for the normal situation. COVID is extraordinary condition. That's why we wrote, even I also engaged with Minister of Finance and our President to write the emergency law. Basic principle of fiscal, basic principle of prudent, basic principle of the financial condition. Then we wrote back then, one, during the COVID treaty, targeted, temporary, transparent. Only 3 years, fiscal deficit can be more than 3%. Second, Central Bank can purchase directly to finance the deficit. Third, as long as this is for herd immunity. This only happening 3 years. But now it's already back to normal. Normal, as I said, monetary policy, inflation targeting framework plus exchange rate, plus capital flows management if needed. Macroprudential for counter-cyclical financial cycle using whatever instrument, liquidity, whatever CCB, whatever, as well as financial system stability. This back to normal. But one thing, our innovation in Indonesia, this beyond flexible inflation targeting and monetary policy. This is also apply for our fellows in emerging market where geographic is like Indonesia. Inflation, there is core inflation, administered price, but also food inflation. Food inflation is not only supply demand, but also distribution. You know, then this is where in Indonesia, we have a national movement of food inflation control team. From President, coordinating economic minister, myself, Minister of Finance, State Ministry, all of our governors, municipalities, 46 our branches, we mobilize of Bank Indonesia to address the food supply and distribution directly. This is supply aspect. We are moving all of the component of central and local government to address directly the food supply. Some of them, I said, you know Indonesia, so many rices in East Java, but there is limitation in Sumatra because the distribution and so on. We address that. This is much more effective than interest rate. Same thing, addressing labor supply, labor constraint, much more effective to address the structural reform than interest rate. Interest rate is only the core inflation can be addressed. This is what we are do. So this is where when you are seeing so many problems, be innovative, be creative, but use the basic principle still there. Indonesia, treaty for emergency, but now back to normal, inflation targeting, flexible intervention, but also fiscal, monetary, central, local government coordination.
Next question. There's one right at the back there.
Thank you, Governor Perry, Governor Sethaput, and Deputy Governor Dakila. My name is Mindy. I'm from the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Just like to say, as you have rightly pointed out, that an integrated policy framework response does acknowledge the interactions between multiple instruments used by policymakers, and it's important to pursue multiple objectives and take some holistic view towards the trade-offs and complementarities between such goals. So I'd just like to ask, how then can this IPF be refined to not only address our immediate challenges in economic challenges, but also lay the groundwork for promoting stronger economic growth and resilience. Thank you.
Governor Sethaput, Governor Dakila, go ahead.
Yeah. I think, first of all, it's important to be realistic about what we can expect from the integrated policy framework. Like I said, as a concept, as a direction, as a framework, it's a very useful thing to have. But I think we need to acknowledge that, again, a lot of the tools aren't quite there yet. And so we need to work on those. As I mentioned, we have much better toolkit for looking at monetary policy, but we have a much less sophisticated toolkit, I think, for looking at things like FXI, CFM, or macroprudential stuff. So I would hope that one thing to try to make it more useful, more operational would be improvements in that analytical framework. But even if you do the models to the nth degree, I think it will still come back to judgment that is important. Yeah, that's one thing. But the other thing that I kind of hope to get from this is in our discussion of this is again, and I hope again the second panel will come into this about how to better operationalize it. And I discussed some of the implementation difficulties in terms of the lags and whatnot. But even from a central bank standpoint, aside from talking about linking or coordinating with the Ministry of Finance, just thinking about coordinating and integrating within the central bank. It's not easy, because the people that do, right, the monetary policy, those are your economist types, right? They sit in one department, right? The people that do the FX, those are the markets people that sit in a different department. The people that do macro proof sit, again, and they're, you know, they speak a different language, right? They're trained a different way. For us, in terms of our own governance framework, we actually have different policy committees that look after those two things. We have a monetary policy committee to look after the interest rate, the FX stuff, and then we have a financial institutions policy committee which looks after the macro proof. Those guys meet from time to time, but again, that coordination, you know, from a practical standpoint, isn't always easy. So I think, you know, one thing I hope from this is, like, you know, how do we think in terms of operationalizing this? How do we, you know, develop a common language that we can use, you know, to communicate to people that are trained a different way, and just try to get, when you think about these policy issues, make sure that you internalize the linkages a bit better. So fairly humble objective in that regard. And the last thing that I hope actually from this coming out from this conference and whatnot is just the fact that we're able to have a dialogue on this, I think is useful. Why? Because if we look back, right, you know, there's certain things that were initially, I think, were taboo. You couldn't say them, you know. It's like, you cannot say exactly. And you know, that's not very productive, right? You sort of say, when you start to talk about foreign exchange intervention, and the first response from people will say, you shouldn't do it. I mean, then, you know, how do you go ahead? How do you move forward? How do you think about developing analytical framework to decide, you know, under what circumstances should you do FXI? How much should you do it? All that stuff. You know, that whole conversation gets chopped off right away. So I think, you know, bringing, you know, the discussion, right, so that you can talk about all these other things, FXI, it is, I think, you know, a very, very important. And also perhaps other even more contentious, you know, taboo type words like CFM, right? Capital Flow Management. I mean, you know, you can't say this. You do anything that, you know, even looks or smells like CFM, immediately like, no, cannot. So, and I understand we don't want to go there. You obviously big downsides as we discuss with any kind of instrument that you use. But the point is, I think, you know, having this context or this framework which allows you to discuss these things in I think a more, you know, less dogmatic, less doctrinaire manner, that this is not taboo, is a way to you know, move ahead and actually you know, use this framework and these tools in a more constructive manner. So,
Governor Dakila, you wanted to add?
Okay. For the last couple of years, actually, what we've experienced are quite an unprecedented sequence of shocks. First from the COVID pandemic, then the Russia-Ukraine war, the Fed tightening, and now what we're managing are inflation pressures at the time when there is a very careful balancing of how to achieve price stability, and at the same time be able to recover from the pandemic. As of now, our economic growth has been quite strong, but there was a sharp deceleration in the second quarter, due mainly to fiscal underspending. But again, with that, if, for example, there is a resumption of pressures on the currency, the questions would then be on how much to intervene, to what extent, and as I've said, currently much of those answers come from back of the envelope computations and past experience. It's good to have them in the framework that says this is some time when it's good to have some intervention, and this is another time when it's better to refrain and to let the market determine the general direction of policy. So again, the integrated framework is a tool, and quite formally, if I'm going to look at it, it just says you maximize, you have an objective, and you have a set of policy instruments, and you determine the optimal mix of instruments in order to achieve your objective. But at the same time, I think the challenge should be how do you do that without watering down the messaging that this instrument is geared primarily towards achieving this particular objective. To make it a bit more concrete, what do you do with the inflation target and the policy stance? Hopefully, an integrated framework will mean, okay, the policy stance can remain committed to achieving the inflation target, but you have all of these other policies that are available at your disposal in order to enhance that commitment. I think that there's also room to look at to guard against a situation where you look at all the instruments equally and just have a mix according to what the optimization says. In other words, you may be looking at adjusting the policy stance, not just to achieve the inflation target, but to also achieve all the other objectives of the economy, such as achieving growth, for example, or price, or rather financial stability. So how do you preserve the communication? I think would be a very important factor that should be discussed.
Thank you. I think I will stress what Governor Sethaput. This is actually why we need to have open dialogue. ASEAN is the best implementer of the framework, whatever framework in the world. We have practicing inflation targeting framework in the past. When the world is so peaceful, then we do not need to intervene, right? But when the world is so uncertain, so much spillover, then why we need to complement inflation targeting framework with FX intervention, with capital flows management. We will continue to do that. This is the framework to withstand and to help us against the global spillover. If the international institution can make there is no global spillover, we will practice inflation targeting framework. If the international cannot ensure the to go away the global spillover, then why don't we have open dialogue? The need of FXI, the need of capital flow. Don't say this is taboo. You cannot do that. You cannot do that. That's one. This is where last year we asked IMF to do integrated policy framework. Just to do that. And secondly, we have also dual mandate, financial system stability. What we practice, okay, macro-prudential can address the counter-cyclical of pro-cyclicality of the finance cycle, as I said, but also surveillance, coordination between central bank and FSA. We do that. Then we study microfinancial linkage, how to best this. That's why we ask BIS to do macro-financial stability framework, and we thank them. There's so much, BIS learning from the ASEAN perspective to develop. And that's why let's get together. Let's bring IMF, BIS to this room, to ASEAN, because ASEAN, not only ASEAN, epicentrum of growth, epicentrum of family, epicentrum culture, epicentrum digital, but also in epicentrum of policy mix of integrated policy framework of the IMF, epicentrum of macro financial stability framework of the BIS. Bring together, let's do it, open dialogue, let's solve, move on. Thank you.
Wise words. Thank you very much, gentlemen.